We have 2 more readers this evening. And next up, we have the amazing Brian Sousa. He is the author of a short story collection, Almost Gone. He has had poetry in Redivider, Gavea-Brown, and the Writer Journals. I would also like to add to that, he has had poetry in Quiddity, or short fiction in Quiddity.
Fiction, yeah.
Fiction in Quiddity,
Yep.
yes. He was awarded a Rhode Island Arts Council Fellowship, and he teaches at Boston College. Now, because Brian is so modest, I just thought I'd add a few things to this. And since his mom and daddy are here, I'm just going to say really nice things that I'm going to add to it. No,
You can say things about us being roommates too. Not so nice things.
He is a gifted musician. I cannot over-exaggerate that enough. And he was a 2011 Disquiet Fellow, and he is a poet of exceptional insight. I believe he's going to read fiction tonight, but please seek out Brian's poetry. Everyone, Brian Sousa. I'll save the rest for later.
When we get a drink later, it's not going to be that bad. And these are the things I'm angry about. So I'm just going to read a short section from my book. I used this joke last time, but I know you guys are thinking, he doesn't look Portuguese. Any Portuguese questions can be directed to my father in the back row. So this is called, and I just wanted to thank everyone for having us here. It's amazing. And thanks Millicent for putting this together and put these things together. And so amazing. This is a chapter, so my book is cut up into characters and chapters, so this is a chapter, and the woman who's speaking is Katerina, and it's one last thing. And I'm going to read the first part and then skip to the last part. Katerina, the year 2000. Like a child, he couldn't sit still, but he looked into her eyes until she was the one to look away, as if it was the least he could do. Katerina, your father died yesterday, in Lisbon, at the hotel. Looking back, she thought she would have shaken her head, but she nodded instead. She could not understand why. Where is he now? She asked. Rui blinked. Where is he? He repeated softly. Where? I don't know. They will bring him back here for the funeral, but you, what about you? Are you okay? Come here. He reached out across the table for her hand, but she flinched and rose, weightless suddenly, and glided through the screen door, the rusty squeak echoing in her mind. She stood on the front lawn where the grass was brown in patches and prickled her bare feet, listening to the faint cries of children playing down near the ocean at Playa de Agbaga. Katerina knew her cousin was watching from the doorway. She stayed as still as she could and watched the clouds drift across the tops of the green mountains in the distance. They were moving very quickly. Her father was gone. He would not be back tomorrow, and she would not cook dinner for him again. Her stomach tightened suddenly, and she put her hand on it, wondering if this was what it felt like to be pregnant, wondering if she was going to be sick. What had she said to him as she helped him up the stairs to the train? He had asked her again to come with him. His white hair was combed neatly to the side, and he was dressed in the heavy gray suit that he always wore on his trips to the city. It was the only suit he owned. Had owned, she thought. The only suit he had owned. She did not tell her plans to anyone but Rui, who was 27, 5 years younger than she was, and he helped her arrange for a passport, a visa, a flight. He had been to the States many times in the past, had visited Rhode Island and even New York City. Finding family there had been hard, he warned her, and it would be even more difficult now. Katerina told him that she didn't care. So Rui spent hours on the phone trying to find her a place to live while she sat next to him silently and listened. At her request, Rui also gave her English lessons, teaching her simple words and phrases that she turned over and over in her mouth awkwardly. The time to leave grew closer. Somehow, word of her journey had leaked out to a few people. There were warnings from old friends and cards sent professing sympathy and encouragement. It was not the way she wanted it. She wanted to simply disappear. One night as Rui wrote out flashcards for her, he asked her how long she planned to stay in the States. She hesitated and he frowned. "You think you're lonely here," he said. "Just wait." "I don't know, a year or so at least," she said finally, nonchalantly. But inside she seethed. She pictured streets full of flashing headlights, a new house with glimmering countertops, silver skyscrapers that punctured blue sky. Sometimes she even felt that she was not alone in these visions of the future. Sometimes someone was next to her. Catarina was 32 and unmarried. She couldn't decide if it was because she had never met anyone she would even consider marrying, or if she simply didn't want to marry. She did enjoy her beauty. She found it useful. And there had always been men, the earliest brought to the house for dinner by her father, victims as they drank and chewed of those hopeful, awkward silences that she coveted. She had chosen one from time to time, but they had never really moved her, never worked right. She found reasons to reject them one by one. She preferred being by herself, especially in the morning when the sun shone through her window and warmed her bare feet in bed. One man had stuck around for a while. He was an architect who tied his hair into a long ponytail with a silver elastic. He seemed similar to her at first. He didn't really care. He didn't need her. They existed separately and together, regardless. But in the morning he acted like a child, pushing against her and pleading for her warm body. Regardless of whether she gave in or not, it struck her as weak, and soon she was finished with him. So Catarina lived with her father, cooked for him, and kept him company. And although she admitted often that it upset him that she was still alone, Catarina knew he was better off with her there. She told herself she would always be there for him, no matter what. He deserved it. There was no one to worry about saying goodbye to. Her family was scattered throughout the country. She had never really known her mother's side, but she went over to Rui's house for dinner before she left. From the deck, they watched the dogs run ragged circles in the grass. It had rained the night before, and the smell of salt from the ocean was particularly strong. It was her first time seeing Uncle Armand after the funeral. He raised his wineglass and toasted her, but his eyes looked half closed. "Your father always wanted you to marry," he said, "not to go away alone." "Maybe I take after my mother," Catarina said. The food steamed on the table. Aunt Carmen took her seat and raised her hands to pray. "Such a pretty girl, always," she said, bowing her head. "May God bless you on your trip," said her uncle. He looked at Carmen and sighed. Across the table, Rui drank his entire glass of wine. So we're just going to skip ahead. Catarina was in her bedroom getting ready for her 6th week of work when she thought she noticed something. She had never bought blinds. In fact, she avoided many simple errands because they proved more difficult than she'd imagined. When she went out for something she needed alone, her encounters were reduced to hopeless hand gestures and the nodding and shaking of heads. She made an effort at first, but most people didn't. They just walked away and left her alone. If it was essential, then Manny or Helena would help. But she'd grown used to the bare windows and enjoyed the light that poured in to wake her in the mornings, the moonlight that shone through at night. But now, standing there dripping, a refreshing shiver running through her after a cold shower, she thought she felt something. Did she feel it or see it? She peered across the yard. It seemed strange that the blinds to Helena's bathroom window were down, because the rest of the windows were open. She could smell fish frying. Helena was cooking lunch. She let her towel drop and pulled on a pair of underwear and a bra quickly, jerking up the straps. The bottom of the blinds inched up. She squinted in the stuffy haze of summer. Now there were a few inches between the windowsill and the blinds. If she could see the window so well, and if someone was there, they could see her. She slowly stepped to the side, her stomach a little queasy. She was out of sight now. Catarina craned her neck and watched as the blinds lifted a bit more. Below them, all she could see was darkness, but as she sat on the bed to brush her hair, she thought of how Nuno's face reddened whenever he saw her. Caterina stood before the window and began brushing her hair. The breeze came through the screen softly and dried her skin. She had left the radio on downstairs, and a song that she recognized came on. American music, she had decided, was disorganized and beautiful. Like graffiti on city streets, it was nothing like the careful plucking of fado that her father had listened to each night. Suddenly, Caterina felt a pair of eyes alight on her and run down her legs and across her arms, as fast as the wind, as faint as the music. Her whole body tingled for a moment. The blinds suddenly came down with a snap. She heard Elena's voice calling for her husband to come to the table. Caterina quickly dressed. On the way to work, she decided that she could not be sure of anything. She could also not be blamed for anything. She pulled into the restaurant in a satisfying cloud of dust. 3 days later, on the first Saturday in August, Helena died. Caterina had worked a lunch shift but left early when not many customers showed, promising Manny she would be back to set up for dinner. He had grown more persistent with her lately, his face soft and defeated, as he sat nursing a glass of wine or whiskey at the bar. He asked her to stay and drink with him after each shift, but she barely did anymore, preferring to drive home, speeding in the night air, singing along with the blaring radio as she shifted gears. She knew he would keep waiting for her. When she did stay, she indulged him, sat close to him at the bar, watched him grow flustered and shaky as she giggled and poked his arm. It was 3 p.m. There was an ambulance in front of Helena's house, the lights flashing silently. Further down the street, 2 teenage boys were playing frisbee. Caterina walked across the yard and stood on the front steps, peering inside. Nuno sat at the kitchen table with his back to her, his head in his hands. Just as she was about to knock, a young man with blonde hair tapped her on the shoulder. "Are you family?" he asked quietly. She turned and looked at him. He was biting his bottom lip. "No?" she said, because she thought she understood, and then followed him as he walked to the ambulance. "He doesn't want to come to the hospital," the man said quickly, pointing inside. "He told me just to take her away. Are you a friend?" Caterina stared at him. "Friend," she said. "You may be in shock," he said, and he touched the side of her shoulder. Caterina nodded and then shook her head to cover herself both ways. The man looked puzzled. Caterina walked over to the ambulance and looked inside. She could see the large heap that was Helena, covered in a blanket. "Hey, Freddie," called the man from the front seat. "You ready?" "I'm sorry, she's gone," said Freddie, standing behind Caterina now. "We need to take her away. Tell her husband we will be in touch concerning the arrangements for everything, or you can call the hospital." Caterina nodded, this time sure of herself. She couldn't remember the last thing that Helena had said to her. She wondered if Helena was in Lagos now. She wanted to believe that she was, but somehow she couldn't. As the ambulance pulled away, Caterina walked back up the steps to the front door. It was still open, and Nuno was still seated at the table. He was breathing deeply, almost as if he were snoring. Caterina stood in the doorway and watched him for a while, wondering what she should do. "Nuno," she said. "Nuno?" He raised his head and turned around. His nose was wet and red. He waved her away. Over the next few days, she kept her eye on him. The driveway filled with cars. She watched people file in and out wearing stiff, dark clothes and carrying flowers. She did not go to the funeral, and she wondered whether Nuno had even known that she and Helena were such good friends. At night, she strained to hear the familiar hum of visitors' voices, speaking Portuguese across the yard, standing at the window with her ears against the screen. And she let him watch her. It started almost immediately, and now it was more obvious, the way the blinds rustled as she moved from room to room in the mornings, the way the windows remained open. Caterina thought once she even saw his eyes, gaping and sad, framed with lines, but that was probably just in her head. Standing there day after day, letting the sunlight warm her, Caterina felt Nuno devour every piece of her as she undressed. She stood at the window bare-chested, brushing her hair, or let her towel drop as she danced to music from the radio. The blinds that she eventually bought remained in a heap of plastic bags in the hallway. She liked the fact that when Nuno came home from the club, he tried to force himself to walk slowly to the front door to hide his excitement. Catarina could see it in the tightened way he moved, though. She could feel his pent-up anticipation. She'd been shocked at first, then saddened by the whole thing. But then she found herself amused. There was nothing wrong with it, she thought. Let him stare, she thought boldly. Maybe it was what he needed. She even brought her arm up to wave to Nuno once, standing naked in her bedroom window at dusk, the white light from her lamp shining on her olive skin. But she worried about his heart. So she kept her arm down and slowly turned around so that he could see all of her. Thanks.